The bedroom door had barely clicked shut behind the midwife when he turned his attention to me. I remained resting in the bed, my body still actively bleeding. Only 7 hours had passed since our baby was born, and he was currently asleep in the wooden cradle his father had crafted by hand before the harvest season arrived. Physically, I felt completely shattered, as though my entire being had been turned inside out and incorrectly reassembled. My hands were trembling violently, a reaction not triggered by a cold chill, but by the sheer weight of what I had just experienced. Instead of offering comfort, grasping my hand, or bringing me a glass of water, he took a seat on the mattress edge and announced that we required a discussion regarding the timeline for returning to our regular marital routine. I was only 22 years old. My firstborn had just entered the world inside a farmhouse located in Holmes County, Ohio. Yet, mere hours after our son's birth, my husband sat next to my bed, explaining that he had already figured out the exact number of weeks he was prepared to wait. I grew up inside this world, completely immersed in the Old Order Amish lifestyle, before I eventually chose to walk away. This space serves as the place where I can finally voice the realities that my community absolutely forbade me from ever speaking aloud. For anyone seeking an authentic understanding of what plain life truly entails from an insider perspective, connecting with these accounts helps bring the hidden truth to light. If you have ever experienced a similar dynamic, reflecting on whether anyone ever explicitly articulated what a wife possesses the right to decline might bring some clarity, because in my own life, absolutely no one ever addressed that boundary with me. Growing up, my entire comprehension of matrimony was built on a few core assumptions. I believed a wife was meant to practice total deference and dedicate herself to serving others. I understood that once a woman exchanges marriage vows, her physical self no longer belongs entirely to her. This expectation stems directly from the Ordnung, the unrecorded, unspoken, yet absolute set of laws dictating every single facet of existence within an Amish settlement. The Ordnung deliberately avoids establishing distinct boundaries regarding the extent of a husband's ownership over his wife. Instead, it ensures these lines remain entirely obscured. Within the specific community where I was raised, those ambiguous boundaries invariably favored the husband. My upbringing emphasized that the core intent behind a marriage was the creation of a pious household, centered on raising children, hard labor, and absolute fidelity. I learned that a wife fulfilled her sacred obligation primarily by keeping her husband content. This lesson was never imparted through direct, open conversations, as such dialogues were entirely non-existent. Instead, the message was conveyed through the heavy silence that enveloped specific topics, and through the guarded, cautious expressions that settled onto the faces of older women whenever a young bride appeared visibly exhausted for an extended period. It was communicated by the absolute absence of words like no, aloud, or yours. I was left completely uneducated about what I had a right to request, what I was allowed to refuse, what purpose the postpartum week served for a female body's recovery, or what specific safeguards, if any, the community deemed appropriate to afford a mother. The true implication of that communal silence became undeniable just 7 hours after my delivery. Plain communities observe a traditional practice that remains largely unfamiliar to the secular public. In modern medical terminology, this period is recognized as postpartum recovery. The vast majority of contemporary women understand that the female body requires a minimum of 6 weeks to heal following childbirth. Throughout these 6 weeks, physical intimacy is strongly discouraged by medical professionals because internal tissues are actively mending, meaning a woman is biologically open and highly susceptible to physical trauma. Within my community, this time frame was never treated with warmth or a desire to protect the mother. Rather, it was acknowledged in the exact manner the Ordnung handles most inconvenient realities, by layering it with so many stipulations and caveats that any perceived protection vanished entirely when put into practice. The older women passed down information through a quiet, whispered network, revealing the community's unspoken guidelines. A woman is officially permitted 6 weeks, a duration derived from scriptural interpretations, historical tradition, and the bishop's personal assessment of a female body's physical limitations. For those 6 weeks, a husband is tasked with maintaining his self-restraint. That time frame was supposed to be my shield, but my husband immediately requested that we reduce that period to 5 weeks. Caleb was 26 years old at the time. He did not possess a naturally malicious temperament in the conventional sense of the word. He never raised his voice in anger, nor did he ever resort to physical violence. In various aspects of our life, he demonstrated a gentle nature. He consistently assisted with managing the farm animals and stayed present throughout the entire labor process, which was a duty some men in our settlement actively avoided. He had dedicated 3 months to meticulously constructing the cradle, and in the months leading up to our son's arrival, I would occasionally witness him pausing beside the wooden frame, softly tracing his fingers along its edges. However, Caleb was raised within the exact same culture of absolute silence that had shaped my own upbringing. The lessons he absorbed regarding the duties of a husband perfectly mirrored the lessons I absorbed regarding the duties of a wife. He understood that patience was a commendable trait, and that 6 weeks was the established community standard, yet as he sat next to me while I was still actively bleeding, he concluded that 5 weeks was a sufficient compromise. He never bothered to ask for my input. He simply stated his conclusion with a quiet finality that signaled the topic was entirely closed to discussion. Afterward, he walked downstairs to tend to the livestock, leaving me alone in the bed. My newborn son was sleeping barely 3 feet away, and I lay there realizing I had absolutely no idea if I even possessed the authority to say no. I want to be entirely precise regarding these details, because the scenario sounds vastly different to an outsider than it felt to the person experiencing it from within, and those two perspectives do not align. To anyone looking in from the outside, this situation fits a specific legal definition, a term I have frequently heard therapists and medical practitioners utilize without hesitation in the secular world I inhabit today, entirely removed from the constraints of the Ordnung. From the inside, however, the dominant emotion was profound confusion rather than acute terror or clarity, primarily because I had never been provided with the language or the conceptual framework to understand my situation. I had never experienced a conversation where someone looked me directly in the eyes and explicitly stated that my physical body belonged exclusively to me, or that I retained the absolute right to refuse certain demands regardless of the marital vows I had taken. No one ever offered me that validation. My upbringing provided me only with the concepts of duty and submission, alongside the ingrained belief that a virtuous Amish wife never generates marital discord based on her own physical comfort. Prioritizing one's own physical well-being over a husband's desires was viewed as an expression of hochmut, a profound pride that represents the most egregious sin within our culture. Consequently, I remained still in that bed and began calculating, engaging in the exact mental arithmetic that women trapped in such environments always perform, focusing not on whether I could avoid it, but entirely on how I would endure it. A specific portion of this narrative cannot be shared openly in this setting due to the strict boundaries and content regulations governing this platform. Over time, I have come to comprehend exactly where those digital restrictions lie, which compelled me to document the unedited reality elsewhere. The written account captures the entire experience without any softening of the details or protective omissions, exposing everything the lens is barred from capturing. My close friend Rebecca gave birth to her first child roughly 8 months prior to my own delivery. She confided her experience to me using the subtle, indirect communication style common among Amish women, sharing her reality in fragments while we worked side by side, preserving food in her kitchen during the summer preceding my son's birth. She murmured that the men do not actually honor the 6-week rule, speaking so softly that her voice was nearly drowned out by the clinking of the canning jars. When I pressed her to explain, she paused, set down a jar lid, and stared out the window rather than looking at me, noting that while 6 weeks is the official number spoken aloud, it is never the timeline they actually observe. I remember reflecting deeply on Rebecca occupying her own bed, cradling her newborn infant against her chest, as I contemplated the harsh reality she had already internalized and that I was currently discovering firsthand. In that moment, a profound transformation occurred deep within me, though I lacked the vocabulary to identify it at the time. Years later, during a therapy session with a practitioner who had never donned a traditional prayer cap or navigated the restrictions of plain life, I finally learned the correct term for that feeling, which is grief. My sorrow was rooted not merely in what had transpired, but in the devastating realization of how completely commonplace it was. It required a significant amount of time and years of distance after leaving the community for me to fully grasp this truth and give it a proper name with the assistance of my therapist. The issue did not stem from a solitary individual, nor did it represent a personal deficiency unique to Caleb. It was the product of an entire system. Throughout my entire existence within that community, the structure never once provided a young woman with the necessary vocabulary to safeguard her own physical boundaries within a marriage. It was a framework that publicly designated a 6-week recovery period as a protective measure, yet simultaneously saturated the culture with an intense theology regarding female submission and marital obligation, causing that protective boundary to disintegrate before a woman could ever utilize it. I am personally acquainted with women who successfully maintained the entire 6-week boundary, just as I know women like Rebecca who were unable to do so. I have known women who were entirely unaware that any specific time frame existed because no one had ever mentioned it to them, leaving them to assume from their very first wedding night that surrendering their body on demand was simply the fundamental nature of matrimony. Furthermore, I recognize another critical layer to this dynamic. The men operating within this structure were generally not making deliberate, malicious choices to inflict trauma. They were merely acting in accordance with the lessons they had been taught since childhood, functioning within the exact same culture of absolute silence that enveloped the women. This pervasive silence did not simply fail the wives, it eroded the integrity of the marriages and compromised everyone trapped within it. My marriage to Caleb eventually ended, a dissolution caused not by that single night in isolation, but by the gradual accumulation of countless similar nights. It was the result of hundreds of essential conversations that never took place, driven by a cultural framework that simultaneously designated my body as something sacred, yet denied me actual ownership of it. By the age of 25, when I finally chose to depart, my son was 3 years old, and I was weighed down by a nameless burden alongside a deep resentment that I was forbidden from expressing. The community's response was swift, as the process of Meidung is always immediate. I remember my mother's face as the door was shut against me, a separation executed with the characteristic, unsettling calm of plain communities, occurring as quietly as water turning to ice. My correspondence was returned unopened, and my phone calls were met with perpetual silence. The very community where I had spent my life cooking, sewing, mourning, and celebrating simply erased my existence. That isolation represents the true cost of choosing to leave, and I believe in maintaining absolute honesty regarding that heavy price. Nevertheless, during my time in therapy, an experience that sounds completely incompatible with concepts like the Ordnung, traditional prayer caps, or the reality of Holmes County, I finally began attaching precise language to concepts I had never been permitted to understand. I discovered ideas like bodily autonomy and informed consent, alongside the realization, which felt utterly revolutionary to me at the time, that a woman's physical recovery after giving birth is strictly a medical concern. I learned that medical realities carry inherent rights that cannot be overridden by any theological doctrine. I vividly recall a specific session where my therapist gently explained that the dynamic I was describing constituted a well-recognized pattern of behavior. It was not exclusive to the Amish faith, nor was it unique to plain societies. Rather, it manifests universally wherever vital information is systematically withheld, wherever women are denied the vocabulary to articulate their own physical experiences, and wherever absolute submission is elevated as an ultimate virtue, while self-defense is condemned as a spiritual failing. She pointed out that I had never been taught what I possessed the right to decline, and I responded with the realization that I had never been told I was allowed to say no at all. We sat in silence for a long time, absorbing that truth. Before concluding, it is vital that I speak carefully and fairly regarding Caleb, because providing that context is essential. I have spent a long time untangling which actions belong to him as an individual, and which stem directly from the culture that shaped him, and I have never found simple, clear-cut answers. He was not an inherently evil person. He was simply a man raised within the exact same limitations that governed my own life, burdened with a profoundly incomplete and warped understanding of what he was entitled to demand from his wife. He had never been exposed to a behavioral framework that accommodated a woman's right to refuse her husband, so when the situation arose, he acted entirely without that awareness. Acknowledging this context does not absolve his actions, but it introduces a layer of complexity that is vital to the narrative, because the true essence of the story resides within that very complexity. The reality is not defined by an obvious villain, but by an ordinary man and an ordinary woman operating within a community that stood behind them and offered nothing but absolute silence. The Ordnung deliberately leaves these matters unrecorded because what remains unwritten cannot be openly questioned or challenged. This lack of documentation ensures that the rules can be constantly molded by whichever individual commands the greatest power in a given setting. Within my own marriage, inside that farmhouse in Holmes County where my son was a mere 7 hours old and the midwife had just departed, I lacked any form of authority. I recognize that reality clearly now. It required the passage of many years, significant geographical distance, and the guidance of a therapist working out of a sunlit office filled with windows before I could fully comprehend that my experience was not simply the unavoidable nature of marriage. I had to learn that there was absolutely nothing holy about that pervasive silence, and that a body which had just endured hours of intense labor to usher a new life into the world was profoundly entitled to rest, recuperation, and the absolute right to say not yet. That right exists not because of a specific rule or a designated number of weeks, but simply because my body belongs to me. If you were raised in an environment that never provided you with that fundamental validation, or if you were conditioned from an early age to believe that your physical well-being must always be sacrificed to accommodate someone else's religious doctrines, your experience is completely valid. If you have ever found yourself awake in a dark room, mentally negotiating the complex boundaries of obligation while trying to determine what you are genuinely permitted to decline, your struggle is recognized. You bear no blame for your lack of understanding because you were never provided with a proper map to navigate those boundaries. Through sharing these experiences, I am attempting to help reconstruct that map. For anyone who wishes to understand the realities of this journey, sharing these truths and reflecting on these experiences with others who need to hear them can be a vital step toward healing.